So welcome to everybody joining me here in this session today. And I hope you're having a good start to week 4, particularly in Triple M 132. This lecture is being recorded and I hope you're also settling in well to your trimester and the rest of your studies at Deakin. Just a reminder too that if you've got any questions about the studies, the content, the assessment, or other matters, do let us know. We're always happy to help you. And anything that's not personal or private, but is related to our unit, Triple M 132, then please make use of the discussion forums, and that's where Donovan can help you. And that way too, everyone benefits from the answers. There's also the opportunity to have a one-on-one consultation with another tutor, Andrew, and you just need to send him an email, Andrew Wang, and arrange a time to meet. He'll answer your emails, but also you can have a one-on-one consultation, and usually that's through Zoom too. So that's another option if you want to get started there. Okay, so this week we are looking at well, before we go too much further, but this week I'll just go back here and introduce our topic first of all, getting a bit excited there. But this week we're covering ethics, corporate social responsibility and sustainability. And in terms of your assessment, this week's topic on CSR is relevant to task 2 of assignment 1.2, and that's the business report that's due in week 8. So not the one that's due next week. But essentially the key message from this week's topic is that organisations and managers, they can and they do affect society. And when we looked at the environment in last week's topic, in topic 3, you'll remember that things like the government's laws, advocacy groups, and the way that society is set up. There's a whole lot of things that can influence the way that organisations work. And so we just need to be mindful of that connection. Okay, so now we'll do our acknowledgement of country. And so just get that up here. So just mind moving some things. As we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect the meaning of place, and in doing so recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of all the land we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. And so here our acknowledgement of country comes from the Victoria Police. And similarly to many other organisations, the Victoria Police engage with our Indigenous people. So again, all organisations now have Indigenous policies, Indigenous recognition strategies, and also inclusion strategies too. And for our example, being from the Victorian Police, we know that they're the ones that check that we as a society are following the law and are meeting all those ethics and rules that our society deem important. So looking now at our learning outcomes for this week. So there are 8 learning outcomes and they come from chapter 5. And just a reminder too, when you're reading the chapters from the textbook, it's really helpful just first of all to skim read to get a feel for the ideas and the concepts. And then you can do a bit more of an intensive read in preparation for your seminars and of course for your assignments too. And you might also be aware that there's a highlighting function in the textbook, and that can be quite useful just to remind you and keep note of what those important concept definitions are or whatever it might be. And as I mentioned too, this week, this topic is assessed in the second task in assignment 1.2. Okay, just seeing there's a chat. I might come to the questions at the end if that's all right, but maybe other students can help reply. If you know the answer, that would be great. Okay, so first of all, I won't go through all of those learning outcomes, but that's what we will be focusing on as we go through this week's topic. But first of all, though, in relation to our topic of ethics, we've got some examples here just to illustrate some of the main concepts that we'll be looking at. And the first one here are some obvious examples about ethical and unethical behaviour. Things like people who sell you fraudulent investments and rip you off, and people who will sell you a bad car or a lemon, as we call it, and tell you it's a really great deal, but it's broken down before you even get home. So these examples raise ethical questions about the way that people are operating. And, what does it say if someone knowingly sells you something that's faulty or overpriced? And so when we're looking at ethics, these are some of those really clear ones that are very, very obvious. But there are some other examples that are a little bit trickier or a little bit more difficult to see where that ethical line is. So, for example, during the pandemic, many companies were given money or funds from the government through the JobKeeper policy. And the aim of those funds were to be used to support employees who might have been stood down or had their hours reduced. But as it turned out, during the pandemic, some of these companies actually made more money through things like online shopping. And so as a result, they got that JobKeeper money from the government and they didn't actually need it or use it. And so the question here is, given that the government just gave these companies money without really providing many conditions or requirements for them to pay it back, should the company just keep it as a kind of a windfall? Or, should they return it because they didn't use it and it is government money? So these are ethical questions that managers in the company would need to address. And a lot of the companies and directors like Solomon Lew, who you might know from owning Chadstone, the big shopping centre here in Melbourne, they were under a lot of pressure to repay that unused money that they received in JobKeeper. And in fact, many did repay the excess funds that they profited from with the government payments, but they didn't have to do it. So it wasn't a legal requirement for them to give that money back. And so this brings me to an important aspect about ethics. Now, we know the basic ethics, of course, is to keep within the law, but then there are many companies who might go above and beyond that minimum legal requirement when it comes to ethics and how they fit into society, and also in terms of their social responsibility and things like their activities towards sustainability is another aspect there. So in a sense, what's legal is kind of the minimum, and it's not considered as particularly good just to meet only that minimum level. So So a lot of people would argue that it's because organisations are part of a society, because they're part of our society, then they should contribute to society in positive ways and maybe bring society forward in ways that go beyond just those minimum legal requirements. So with this example, again, you might ask, what was the intention of the JobKeeper payments to these companies, keeping their employees in jobs? But in reality, this company didn't lose money. They managed to keep their people in jobs. So that's the ethical issue. Now, sport also raises ethical questions. And this one there was a cricket ball tampering incident from a few years ago now. So questions like, should you be rubbing sandpaper on the ball to try and affect its speed and get an advantage over the other team? Again, that's a question of ethics, and different people might have different opinions as to what's wrong here, but it's still an ethical issue. And things like drugs in sport, that's also another kind of thing. Now, another example relates to bad behaviour, and this example is a bit of an interesting one. So some years ago, the head of Victoria Police's ethical standards body, he had to resign because he was posting really racist comments and comments that were very inappropriate about employees and his colleagues. And he was doing that under a pseudonym on YouTube. But eventually he was found out, and as a result, he had to quit. And so I guess the real issue here is, as a police officer and as someone holding that leadership position, we expect this person to operate at a much higher standard. And the ethical standards of police officers in Australia in general are very high. And when they behave in a way like that, then it becomes very big news. An example there, concussion in sport. That's a great example. Well done. Yes, thank you for sharing that with everyone. Again, what are the guidelines there and the responsibilities of managers to help make people stop and not go on and continue playing and risking their health in that way. Moving on to the next example, and this one is another ethical issue, which is unfair advertising. And here this shows Google was fined $1.7 billion, huge amount, by the European Union for breaching their advertising rules. And again, this is all tied up in legal constraints, but it is still an ethical issue. Again, what are the grey areas in making claims about products or services that perhaps may not be quite true? And here's another example you might be familiar with, and this relates to sexual harassment or seeking favours in the workplace. And this is all about using power over others to try and get your way. And of course, Weinstein's now in prison for that. And this example, although it relates to the acting industry, it's still relevant to all workplaces. And, you know, people shouldn't be bullied, harassed, or asked for personal favours in exchange for workplace benefits. And again, another example here is, and this is a really big example, is where employees help their friends with theft from the organisations where they work. Or maybe it's even the employees themselves who are thieves within the organisation. And this article explains how it is an epidemic and it costs companies huge amounts. So $1.5 billion a year is the estimate because of those employees stealing from their workplace. And this is another ethical issue, but it can also be a little bit of in the grey area, so not quite so clear cut. So for example, if you take a pen from work and you use it at home, or if you use your work issued computer to run your own business that's separate from the purpose that you were given that laptop to actually work for or use, I mean, these can all be regarded as theft because it's in that person's possession, but it's still in that grey area of ethics. So hopefully those examples just sort of highlight some of the things that we'll be looking at a bit more detail in today's class. So, but first of all, though, as a way to get started, as always, we look at our definitions, and this is really important to get those definitions first, and our definitions come from the textbook so that we are all on the same page. So first of all, ethics is defined as the set of moral principles or values that defines right and wrong for a personal group. And this is a really important concept in our personal as well as organisational life. What are the moral principles that govern what's right and wrong, and the choices and behaviours that we make or that we expect of a group? And whereas the business ethics, this is applied ethics. So this is applied to the workplace, the business situation, real world situations in which transactions occur. So how should we apply our values in the way that we conduct our business? And from a theory point of view, there are different levels that we can analyse ethics in an organisation and the way that ethics affects an organisation. So first of all, if we look at the ethics of the system. So, you know, this is where, if we use an example that we're selling secondhand cars, we'd look at the ethics or the laws of that particular industry. You know, what's the way that everybody in that industry is applying their ethics? And then there are the ethics of each organisation. So let's say within the industry, you know, we'd be looking at the particular morals and values that are held towards what we do in the way that leaders manage their business, for example. And that might be affected by their colleagues or their supervisors, as well as the culture of the organisation. And then, of course, at the lower end there, we've got the ethics of the person. So as an individual, we get our ethics from a lot of different sources. You know, it starts mostly with our family. Our religion can influence our sense of ethics, our peer groups, also our culture, and also, you know, just generally our experiences as we move through life. But all of those around us influence our individual personal ethics. Now, within this framework, though, there's also other elements to look at in terms of the ethics of an organisation. And the first one there at the top on the left is the descriptive. So this is where we can describe and even give examples of what's right and what's wrong about how to do things. The normative aspect, this is looking at the accepted values or the ways of doing ethics. So if we look at the normative ethics of the Australian system and compare it to another country's system, there might be some differences. There might be some similarities, but then the normative ethics might show up more differences. And the last one there is the analytical. And that's really for us as students looking at this, or maybe researchers, where they try and draw out the concepts and models that really help us to get a more in-depth understanding about the different approaches to ethics by individuals or by the system or within organisations. And ethics is a very highly researched area, and you may be learning as you're studying different units in your degree that there's an ethical element that you have to cover, whether it's in accounting or management or even in the law. And that's because the universities consider it very important to teach students who will then go out into the real world and apply ethics. And of course, the university we want you to be ethical in your behaviour, particularly in business and commerce. Okay, so next we will look at dilemmas and the types of influences that managers face in ethical decision making. And again, keeping in mind that the principles are the same. So whether you're in an organisation trying to make a decision, or whether you're at home making an ethical decision or at the shops, the principles are pretty much the same. But of course, in an organisation, they've got a huge impact, and managers need to manage these ethical decisions within their organisation because it's often the managers that are liable for the decisions of their employees. So first, let's have an understanding about what is an ethical dilemma. So, and often, it is very easy to say when we look at ethics, and like with some of those examples from the start of our lecture, we might have a clear idea about what is ethical and that's ethical and that's not ethical, for example. But the reality is that it can be very complex. And in the main, a lot of the decisions that we have to make, they have a little bit of both. They have some positive aspects, as we can see there with the angel, and they can also have some negative aspects. And so when there is a decision to be made, but the choice of options isn't really clear cut as to what the right thing to do is, then that's what we call an ethical dilemma. And there are a lot of decisions that have to be made, and there can be good and bad that come from those decisions. But as managers, we still have to make a decision, even when we aren't sure, or even when there is a dilemma. So when we do have to make decisions, our ethical answers can depend on a few things. Now, we've listed 3 here, but there are more, but these are the 3 main ones that we are looking at. So the first one there are the terminal and instrumental values. So terminal values are looking at what it is that we want to achieve. So what are our goals? What are our objectives? What's the end result that we want to get? So for example, it might be big concepts like, do we want to be free? Do we want to have equality? Do we want to maintain our integrity? The instrumental values, on the other hand, these relate to how we behave in order to reach those goals. So for example, are we honest and follow the rules, or do we cheat? Do we help others along the way, or do we nudge them and push them out the way so that we can get ahead and get a bit of an advantage? Now, another aspect that our ethical answers depend on is our moral development. So some managers and employees have very low levels of development, and that's when they might think it's okay to cheat and basically do whatever they can to get away with things. But then there are other people who have very, very high standards of moral development, and so they are much more risk averse, and they're more likely to make decisions that are more ethical, and they do have a stronger sense of ethics and what is the right thing to do. And the third aspect that our ethical answers depend on are some principles, ethical principles to help us solve the problems. So let's look at some of those principles next. So these principles, and there are 7 listed here, one way to look at them are like rules that help to guide our ethical decision making. So we can use these in different situations. We might even use a combination, again, depending on the situation. So just to apply some of these principles to an example, and then we'll go through each one. So if we think of an example, like we're a manager at a department store, so maybe something like Kmart or Target, and we find a 10-year-old child has stolen something. So they've taken something off the shelf, put it in their pocket and walked out of the store. So depending on these ethical principles as a company, they might have a different set of policies. Okay, so the first one there, the utilitarian policy, might be that anyone who steals or there's any theft of any description, the policy is that we will call the police regardless of who the thief is. So the consequence is that the police will always get called because we want a policy of knowing that the greater good for everybody is that the police get called. The consequences apply to everybody. The end justifies the means. Now, another is the universalism principle. And this is a duty-based approach. And so this would consider the welfare and the risks of everybody. So using our example, a manager might say, well, okay, hang on a minute. This is quite risky and stressful for our staff, particularly when it comes to detaining a child, a 10-year-old child, and calling in the police. So instead, using a duty-based approach would be having a policy that in the case of thieves who are under 13 years old, we won't call the police, but instead we'll take the product back, we'll get the security guard to give them a talking to for 10 or 15 minutes, making sure that there's another adult in the room, and then we'll set them free. Now, another approach, the third one there, is the rights approach, and that would be that all thieves, regardless of age, have the right to be assumed innocent until proven guilty, and that's their right. So we might have to build that into our policy that we can't accuse people. The way that we deal with them is important. They have rights, and those rights are very much tied in with the laws and things like the United Nations. So we all have rights for jobs, different rights to work, so on. So this approach is very much a legal-based approach, and that legal-based approach is how we would manage our ethics. The fourth one there is the justice approach. So we'd be looking at trying to find the right procedure to deal with the child. So, we might say, okay, well, part of our procedural approach would be to have 2 adults as soon as there's an incident. Should we take them into a room? Should we do this? Should we do that? And so the procedures are very much about the rules around the ethical decision making. Justice is where we might compensate someone for a problem, and retribution is where we get back at them if there's a problem. And in terms of our example, we'd be looking at making sure that we have a really valid set of procedures that would include maybe training the staff in those procedures, making sure that the staff then followed those procedures and that maybe they wrote up each event so that that would create another level of procedure to ensure that in the end that justice was happening. The fifth one there is virtue ethics. So this is character-based. So the manager of or the team might have a really soft spot for children, and they might take the view that all children are innocent and children don't intentionally do that kind of thing. And so out of the goodness of the way that they view life, they might set the child free in terms of being caught for theft. Another one there, number 6, is the common good. And that's about what's good for everybody. So is it good in society that we all know that if somebody steals, that we call the police? And this is quite similar to the utilitarian approach, but the common good is the main consideration. You know, what's good for the community, what's good for society, what's good for everybody. And finally, the last one there is ethical relativism. And that considers how one form of ethical behaviour compares to another form. So using our example, we might say, okay, if someone comes in and steals something under $10, we're just going to take it back and we're not going to bother with the police, or we're not even going to chase them to talk to them. We'll just turn a blind eye. But if they stole over something that was, you know, worth more than $10, then we would take action. So another way of looking at ethical relativism is to look at different countries. So, for example, in a wealthy country like Australia, you know, we would say that it's unethical to employ children. But in very poor countries, where if the only job that any member of that family can get is for a child, as long as it is it ethical for that child to take on a job? Because really that's the only money that that family can get. So sometimes ethical relativism can be a comparison between countries. And, you know, another aspect to that is perhaps, you know, money that's sort of in the black market, or money that's under the table. So, you know, where people are perhaps giving or receiving bribes. And, you know, that might be at the government level, it might be at the organizational level, you know, accepting bribes for favors. And again, that may be the norm in some countries, but it's certainly not the norm in Australian industry and Australian businesses. And so that would be another example of ethical relativism. But these 7 principles here, these are all just different ways of thinking about ethics and helping to guide you when you are making a decision in relation to a dilemma, for example. So how can we, as managers and leaders, how can we encourage ethical decision-making in our companies? Now, there are quite a few steps that managers can use to encourage ethical decision-making in their organisation. And what companies can do, first of all, is work on selecting and hiring ethical employees. And this can depend on the human resource policies in the company. There can also be things like integrity testing and personality testing. But something to be aware here, and this is our critical thinking, is that some of these tests can be challenged, and not everybody would say that personality testing is a good indicator of integrity testing. So if managers are going to use these tests, they really need to make sure that they have good evidence that the tests they do use give them the answers that are appropriate to the questions being asked and the information that they're trying to find. Now, other steps that managers can take to encourage ethical decision-making in their company is to establish a code of ethics, or, you know, this is like a set of rules. Now, at the end of last century, code of ethics were very, very popular. But what people found was that that they would create a code of ethics, but it would kind of just sit on the shelf and nobody would look at it. And when that happens, it can become problematic. So if you've got a code of ethics, the people in the organisation, and that includes the managers as well as the staff, they need to live that ethics. So, so the ethics and the social responsibility of the organisation really need to be part of the culture of the organisation. And this week in the seminars, we'll be looking at an article by a Deakin academic, Greg Woods, and that discusses that idea a little bit more. So when we're looking at the code of ethics, it needs to be, as we said, part of the culture, the way that we do things around here, not a book that sits on a shelf that we only get out if we're in trouble and maybe we have to go to court. So the key point here is that these codes of ethics are really good as long as they are operationalized and that they work all the time. Other things that managers can do in organisations to promote ethical decision making is to have training, ethics training, and this includes developing employee awareness of compliance. And at Deakin, certainly our staff, we have to undertake various tests and compliance training on a fairly regular basis. So things like ethics and working with children, health and safety, and those sorts of things. And so there is a lot of different compliance related training that relates to this. And training, it also has an advantage to increase credibility with employees. So, and that helps to create a culture where the employees understand and follow and essentially believe in the ethics policy. And finally, to teach a practical model of ethical decision making. So this includes things like training your managers, particularly if you're in an industry where there are a lot of ethical dilemmas. So this training can really help managers to, as we can see on the right there, number one, identify what the problems are, try and look at the constituents. In other words, the people who are being affected by the problem and the decisions being made. Help them diagnose the situation, analyse different options and alternatives, then make a choice, and finally to take some action. So there's also the ethical decision-making model. And in week 6, when we look at decision-making, we'll look at the general rational decision-making model. And again, depending on your organisation that you're working in, sometimes these models can be really refined and helpful in making decisions. Looking again, continuing our list on the left-hand side there, managers can also establish an ethical climate. So that's basically an ethical culture. And the last point in green there is to managers can act ethically within the organisation. And this involves then being active in the company ethics program, having a system where violations of ethics can be reported. And this ties in with the whistleblower image on the right there. And again, many organisations do have whistleblower programs where people within an organisation can report any concerns they have about ethics or people's behaviour. Certainly the modern approach for whistleblowers is that people who make complaints about problems or violations, they can do that anonymously so that their identities aren't revealed. And, even things like on Facebook now, you can, as a member of the public, report what you think are violations and fake news and that kind of thing. So these are the kinds of approaches that can be made at organisations too. And lastly, the other aspect there is to punish those who violate those codes of ethics. And so this can be included into policies. So there might be, for example, if you have 3 violations, then that's the 3rd strike and you're out. You might be able to train people, you might be able to consult and have meetings with them, but the 3rd strike in terms of violating those codes of ethics means that you're asked to leave. So this does need to be managed, particularly when you've got problematic employees. So these are all the different types of steps that managers can use to try and encourage ethical decision-making in their organisation. And if you notice yourself as students, many of you in your first trimester, you're being trained in academic integrity. And this is part of the ethics of being a student. So you're learning about what is the academic integrity policy. You'll be given advice and examples. In last week's seminars, we talked about ChatGPT very openly. And so having that open discussion and talking about it, that's a very important part of that process. And just finally, you'll see there on the top right, there's an image there, "We are watching you." And this is often called the panopticon of control. And sometimes, again, we talk about this in the control topic later in the trimester. But basically, what this is showing us, these eyes, if we think we're being watched, then we often self-manage. And, for example, if you go into a store and you try on some clothes, there's often a sign saying, "We are watching you," or even if there's no camera, it might alert us to engage in our ethical values, and it might even scare us to not steal anything, to not do the wrong thing. And similarly, outside your home or units or apartments and things like that, there might be some video cameras, and they might be fake. But if people think they're being watched, then it can influence them to behave more ethically than if they thought they could get away with something. So the reality here is, though, even though a camera may not be watching you, but it's the self-control that you put on yourself when you think you are being watched. And so that's another way to influence ethical decision-making and ethical behaviour, is to have employees believe that they are being observed, and that what they're doing, their actions, are being observed too. So ethical leadership, as we're starting through our discussions, we can see is really important. And this stems at the organisational level from having a very clear vision, mission, and also value statements. And these also in turn inform policies that then guide the plans, so the strategic plans, but also the operational plans. And, looking at, well, what's the nature of our business? What business are we in? What are the products or services? What are the core competencies, as it says there, in what we're doing? And who are our customers? So everything that the leaders do in the organisation needs to be ethical, but it also needs to be aligned to the ethical values and policies and fit in with that overall ethical framework. I'll just mute. And so ethical leaders have to create a corporate environment by displaying virtue, related values, and act with authenticity and integrity towards their followers, stakeholders, and their communities. And leaders need to show respect towards others, treat their stakeholders fairly, work towards a common good, build community, and be honest. So one way that leaders can do all of that is by empowering their followers to also act ethically and to be selfless leaders that are servants to their staff and who work for them and with them. And these are just various approaches to ethical leadership. Now, another aspect of ethics is are the regulations or legislations or laws that affect ethics in organisations, and there are quite a few of them. So the first one that we can see here is the ACCC, which is the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. And basically this is the watchdog that's got responsibilities to protect consumers and stop companies from trying to reduce their competition. So if two companies collude and talk to each other about pricing or fixing the prices of their goods, then they could be breaching the ACCC law. And we know from last week, it's very important in our economy that organisations, particularly those in the same micro environment, that they compete with goodwill. They don't collude to fix prices or fix the prices of the input products or whatever it might be. So, for example, if Woolworths and Coles got together to talk about the pricing of their products in their supermarkets, then they might be subject to an investigation and even fines from the ACCC. Now, another one there is ASIC, and that's the Australian Securities and Investment Commission. And they give licenses to financial entities such as banks, and so that they can offer financial products and services. And it's through ASIC that companies register themselves, and there are quite clear-cut rules about what those companies can and can't do. And the third one there is APRA, and they regulate the financial entities and what they do, and they also ensure that they maintain a minimum level of financial soundness. And these three here, these are all government organisations that set policies and rules and also regulate many industries companies. Last week we talked about TEQSA, which is the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards, and they regulate university behaviour. But another one is the Fair Work Commission, and they administer the Fair Work Act, which is all about the rules and regulations about employment in Australia and fair work for people, making sure that they're getting the right pay, the right conditions. And so this act works to protect employees and employment. And the last one we'll mention is the Australian Human Rights Commission. And this is another body that's very important in regulating things like the discrimination laws within Australia. So what we can see from all of these different bodies are the legal context, and how that legal context is really important in order to influence ethical behaviour in organisations. Now, our second topic for today is, and the next topic that I want to talk about is corporate social responsibility. And as I mentioned at the beginning of today's lecture, this is relevant to your Assignment 1.2 business report that's due in week 8. And you'll be looking at CSR in relation to your selected organisation. So our definition, again, always starting with our definitions, this is the view that corporations have social responsibilities and obligations beyond purely to make a profit, and that they should involve themselves in the social issues of the day. And so really, CSR, or corporate social responsibility, it's about stakeholder engagement and contributing to both internal and external awareness to do the right thing. So the companies could be engaging externally, and that might include things like, the local community groups or schools, or it could be internally, and that could be various groups and societies within a particular organisation itself. And, examples, Bendigo Bank, as part of its corporate social responsibility, they provide funding to Deakin and other universities to help with projects, and we use it to improve our student experience. And I've got some examples here too, just to show some of these ideas and concepts. And this first one is an example of good social responsibility, and that is providing free textbooks to the world, and that we are using for our unit. So OpenStax, it's part of Rice University, and so part of their social responsibility is to package up their textbook and provide them free online to people all over the world. So regardless of wherever you are, us here in Melbourne, Australia, but South Africa, Asia, Africa, wherever it might be, all of us have access to this current textbook, Principles of Management. And this is CSR because if you notice in the darker green box, OpenStax believes that learning is a public good and that every learner has a fundamental right to pursue their education in areas that inspire them most. And their goal is to remain 100% free and easily accessible. So you can see that the free textbook from Rice University is them acting in a socially responsible way. Now, you might think of your personal social responsibility, and in the present box there's an option to provide some money towards that. So they say that if everybody who reads this book gives $12, then OpenStax can be a public good for years. So if you're saving $120 on a textbook, which is what our previous textbook used to cost, you might want to contribute in that way and think about social responsibility for yourself as an individual. Now, moving from a good example to a bad example, and this includes single-use plastics. So we can see from these images just how bad an impact that has had on the environment across the world. Another bad example is unsafe buildings. And this is an image from 2013, the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh. It collapsed and over 1,000 workers died. And but the sad thing is, before this incident happened, it was well known that this building had structural issues, but no action was taken. And more recently, you might remember in Florida, there was an apartment building that collapsed as well. It had been inspected and they'd noted the structural problems, but again, no action was taken with devastating results. So good CSR would have meant that actions should have been taken. So we can see here that when nothing happens, or when there's inaction or poor actions, it can have very severe and big consequences. Here's a better example though, and this is from the Geelong Cats, and they're an Australian football team, for those of you who don't know, and they made their stadium a gambling-free zone in 2019. So they decided to forego earning all the extra money they could get from their poker machines and gambling inside their club, and they now have a gambling-free zone. And again, because in their view, gambling has had a very negative impact on society, and in particular their local Geelong community. And so they said, you know, we want to contribute positively and forego that extra money, and hopefully have better outcomes for all. So this is an example of very good CSR. So now that we've got a few examples there, just to sort of clarify our understanding of those concepts, let's look a little bit more at the theory. And when we look at corporate social responsibility, there are two perspectives. So one is the shareholder model, and this says that it's the job of an organisation to maximise its profits for the benefits of the shareholders. So the subtext here is that money shouldn't be wasted doing good for society, because really that's the government's responsibility and community groups' responsibility. So the shareholder model says only do what's good for the company. In contrast, the stakeholder model, this is the second perspective on CSR, this proposes that the long-term survival of an organisation is achieved by satisfying the interests of multiple stakeholders. So not just the owners and the shareholders, but political groups, government, suppliers, competitors, trade associations, employees, unions, advocacy groups, customers, activist groups, all those sorts of things there too. So this is where we discover that some of the CSR behaviours can in fact increase the share value of an organisation or the interests of the community to purchase their products, because they are doing the right thing for society and the community that they're operating in. Now, multinational organisations, they can face some tough ethical issues and challenges too, because they're operating in very complex environments. And so what we're looking at here are some of those multinational issues in relation to the global stakeholders and some of the ethical concerns that they might have. So, you know, things that they have to consider are, you know, what's acceptable and unacceptable when they're doing business in other countries. So they include things like being aware of the different taxation laws or exchange rates in the stakeholder economic environment, in the political environment, you know, being aware and knowing what antitrust laws are and what's the level of corruption, for example, or what treaties and policies might there be. Another is the ecological environmental issues. You know, what's the impact of organisations on the air pollution, water, land pollution, and things like that. And again, sometimes companies might behave badly in a poorer country, or a country where the laws are less stringent or strict, or maybe there's a little bit more corruption and they think they can get away with being less socially responsible. And so one aspect maybe for us in the first world or modern countries is to challenge what they do, you know, and maybe as consumers be a bit more mindful and question, you know, should we buy that really cheap clothing made by people on low wages in third world countries, that, you know, for companies that don't show that they're meeting their social responsibility and ethical obligations. And another one there is the stakeholder social and labour environmental issues are also very important. what are the values and religious customers and so on, and that might have an impact on how employees are treated. What do we need to be aware of if we if we send our workers to, expatriates and working in other countries? What are the workplace and safety rules and expectations? There might be some differences there in standards. And things like the technical environmental issues is another aspect there. So being aware of intellectual property laws or licensing laws. So the key point here is that, when organisations work and go to other countries, they need to be looking at a range of stakeholder issues in the settings of those other countries, and they need to either prevent issues from occurring or manage them well. And so moving on to some other more modern concepts relating to social responsibility and sustainability, a lot of organisations now are investigating the circular economy. So this is instead of that linear economy, which is where companies put things into their organisation or into their production system. So, and those inputs are transformed into a product, they sell it and really don't think about it ever again. But organisations are now starting to think about that circular economy, and importantly, the environmental impact of what they're doing. So, maybe it is offering recycling opportunities, or the products or the wrapping that they use and things like that. So as we can see here, there are different ways that that add to that circular economy. First thing is minimizing waste and being upfront about protecting environmental products and things like that. And that applies to the design of products or the production aspects, how it's just distributed, consumed, and collection of used products. And so all of that needs to be considered and carefully managed, whether it's recycled or reused, how much goes into waste and landfill. So really the goal of the circular economy is to try and minimize and eliminate as much waste as possible. And that's why we have measures on pollution and emissions, and also, the need for companies to be made much more responsible for what they produce as part of their products. And, that applies, for example, the amount of plastic that goes into wrapping and so on, or food that we buy at the supermarket. So this is the kind of thinking that would go into people who are looking at their products, what they produce and what they sell from the perspective of that circular economy. And another thing that companies are thinking about in terms of sustainability are the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. So this was developed some years ago now, and there are 17 socially responsible goals, or the SDGs. And so companies around the world, and many large companies in particular, are signing up to these goals. Some might just sign up to a few, others a few more, and then they try and behave in ways to achieve those goals. So, if we look at, Kmart or Target, if they've signed up to SDG 3, good health and wellbeing, they might look at the health and wellbeing of their employees in Australia, but they also might be looking at the health and wellbeing through their supply chains. For example, those workers in Bangladesh and the other third world countries who might be making their products, the t-shirts that Kmart sells. Or in terms of number 6, clean water and sanitation, what are they doing to clean up the water in the suburbs and the cities where their employees work, and reducing pollution and emissions and things like that. So these goals really assist organisations that want to be proactive in their social responsibility, and to really be quite specific and zero in on the ways that they can make improvements in the societies that they are operating in across the world. And this is seen as a really great measure and guide for organisations to follow. Another area where organisations have a responsibility to comply with, just going back, is the And this is fairly new, the Modern Slavery Act from 2018, and this mandates a worldwide approach to slavery. So the term modern slavery refers to any situations of exploitation where a person can't refuse or leave work because they might be threatened with violence or coercion or some sort of power abuse. And any company that's on the stock exchange that's got a revenue, I think it's over $100 million or more, this act requires them to assess their level of risk of slavery and to provide a report showing how they're managing that risk. So part of that assessment means they've got to look at their supply chains and their operations and see what the risk of modern slavery practices are. And what we can see here are some of those criteria that goes into that report. And often we think of slavery, when we think about it, we think it's from the past and, history, but it's actually a very big problem globally. And, it's reported that there are about 40 million people who are subject to some form of modern slavery. And in Australia, again, we might not think that it's a big problem and statistics are low, but part of that is also a low level of awareness about what constitutes modern day slavery, and the actual incidents may be much higher than what's been reported. So now there is this aspect of social responsibility, and organisations have to make sure that they are very clear that they are trying to reduce or mitigate this. And finally, this is just something you might consider doing for yourself. It's the SDG module, and you can complete it through the Business and Law Skills Toolkit. You can just do the first week, which isn't tested, but you can also go on and do the second and third modules, and you end up with a certificate, and that shows you've got really good knowledge about those sustainable development goals. And these are another thing that modern organisations are addressing. And again, something for you to show that you have and aware of, because organisations do often have to give annual reports about their behaviours. They have to also do a sustainability report in addition to a financial annual report. So you can use this as part of your global citizenship program, and that's separate to your studies, but you get a series of points by doing a variety of things. And that includes maybe going overseas and doing a work integrated learning program or a studies abroad program. And you can build up points to show that you're really well informed about the different aspects of globalization, and you can get a Global Citizenship Award, and that looks really good on your resume. So maybe start with the SDG certificate and see what you need to do to build up your Global Citizenship Award over the years that you're studying at Deakin. So that ends the class for week 4. Thank you for staying on to the end. And again, I apologise for going over time. Keep working on your assignment 1, the business report progress assignment that's due next week, next Tuesday. Any questions, please post them to the discussion forum or bring them along to your seminars. In your seminars this week, we'll be looking at ethics and CSR and looking at some examples. So have a think about your experiences or what you've seen or what you'd like organisations to do. And that would be great to bring those discussions and thoughts along to the seminars. And next week is week 5. This is where we start on the first examinable topic. So to get ready for that, you might skim read chapters 8 and 9. So I'll stop there. Again, thank you for being here and all the best for your assignment. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have if you would like to stick around. Otherwise, see you in the seminars. Bye for now.